Well, hello, friends, and welcome to the Imago Nutrition Podcast. My name is Mark Galesny, and I am one of your hosts, and I am joined by my sister-in-law, business partner, and registered dietitian extraordinaire, Danielle Glesny. Danielle, how are things up in the St. Louis area today?
Very good. Very good. Yeah.
I know we're both kind of dealing with some kids that are a little under the weather and in some respect have been for a little while. It's been a bit of a wicked winter or wicked fall, if you will, but we're getting through it. You know,
you've had a lot. Yeah.
I've had a lot. Each one of my kids, I think, has been sick 2 or 3 times over the last now 9 or 10 weeks. Pretty much from mid-October, they've all kind of gotten sick. We've had flu, we've had strep, we've had stomach bugs. I've got my middle child home right now. He's actually downstairs snacking on a banana, trying to kind of recover from another little bout with a stomach bug. So all that said and done, but we're here. We're excited to talk about today's topic. And so if you've been following us the last all of 2 weeks, we're doing something a little different in January, recording this in January 2023. And so we're doing a series of podcasts on popular diets. Okay. And so again, this is a time of year where folks are open, they're exploring, they're thinking about, they're hearing about, their friends are starting different diets, if you will, or what I call a diet with a name. And so we've been working through some of those. In that week 1, we took a look at keto. And so if you're curious about the health implications or nutritional considerations around keto, you can go back just 2 episodes. Last week, we talked about veganism and vegetarianism. We also talked about kind of the purpose of this podcast is not to, poo-poo diets, because there is evidence that sometimes diets can work in the short term. They can help kind of refine some habits, refine some nutritional intake, recalibrate some things in the short term. But of course, one of the overarching questions is, are they sustainable or need you do them for a long period of time? And so we talked a little bit about that last week. So if you're curious about that, as well as veganism, vegetarianism, take a look at last week's podcast. And today we are talking about the Paleolithic Diet, aka Paleo. And so this is an interesting diet. And so let me give us a little bit of a roadmap, talk about where we're going to go today. So at first, we'll just kind of talk about what is paleo, right? So just kind of what is it? Maybe you've heard that. Maybe you've got friends that are doing CrossFit and they're like, we're going paleo, we're going caveman, we're going Stone Age with our nutrition. And so maybe you're curious about what does that look like. We'll talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons. We'll talk a little bit about also some practical nutrition that we teach and kind of how it compares and contrasts with the paleo diet system. And then ultimately talk about, do we recommend it, or some considerations for you if you've thought about or thinking about it, working into this style of eating. And so with that, Danielle, I know we're going to kind of compare some notes here. As always, we do independent note creation, and then we kind of gather together and collect our notes and hook and jab through the topics. And so I'll get us started, but I think this will be quite a bit of back and forth. I'll toss it over to you at times. And of course, feel free to interject, because this is an interesting one. It's a fun one. It's one that I really appreciate. There aren't many diets. There's very, very few that I said that I would say I sort of get it, right? Like, okay, I kind of see some of the logic behind it. I see some of the validity behind it. And this might be one of those. I personally would not necessarily do paleo, but I understand a lot of why people do, and we'll talk about that. So as I said, this is the diet. The full name is really the Paleolithic Diet, or again, AKA Paleo, AKA Caveman Diet, AKA Stone Age Diet. So what it is, it's basically a style of eating that's consistent with, or believed to be consistent by folks that adhere to it or that have constructed the modern implications of it to mirror the foods eaten by humans during the Paleolithic era. And I'm not very great at history, but we're talking, 10,000 years ago to like 2-3 million, depending on your worldview, right? So we're talking about, certainly tens of thousands of years ago, if not millions of years ago, mirroring the diets of essentially hunter-gatherers in that time. Okay. And so, and Danielle, I think you had some interesting notes on sort of the founding of paleo. One of the things that we were talking about is that you can't say, here's how Paleolithic humans ate, right? Because how they ate in different places around the world at different times, right? Are we talking 10,000 years ago in Asia? Are we talking a million years ago in Africa? Like, what are we talking about exactly? Some of those people had high carb diets. Some of those people had low carb diets. Some of those people had more seasonal food. Some had less seasonal food. Some had different types of animals in their food. And so one starting place is to say that there's really no way to say that they all ate the same by any means, or that this reflects all of the Paleolithic age. But it is interesting to note that they have kind of an interesting founding, right, to the modern application of paleo. So talk about that, because I think it's a bit revealing in why some of the tenets of this diet are the way that they are.
Yeah. So just like you said, it depended on the area, what, plants grew in that area would be part of their diet. It was kind of thought to try this because basically farming was blamed for some of our diseases that we currently have. And when I looked a little deeper into that, basically some archaeological researchers found tools for grinding grains in, over at 30,000-year-old sites. So they probably were actually doing a small bit of farming, if you will, by grinding some grains. And then it also found that some genetic research showed that there might have been also digestion of dairy, like the lactose in milk. So back to the grains, some of the dental remains showed that they were also having some wild grains. So not quite sure, obviously probably some people in that era were not necessarily having grains or using a small farming tool to grind their grains, but it wasn't across the board. So basically kind of where you were located is kind of what you ate, hunted and gathered. So so I don't think we can blame farming on obesity and diabetes and everything else. Obviously, there are some things within that, obviously, that we can pull out. But in general, just because we started farming can't be the complete reason for all. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that points us right into sort of, that's kind of the introduction into the framework of this, right? So paleo is really about, any diet is generally about foods to eat and foods to avoid, right? That's really what dieting is, as opposed to nutrition, which we have a lot more freedom, I believe, with our food choices. However, so let's talk about like what that looks like. So in the Paleolithic diet, the foods that they would purport to focus on or to eat exclusively are in the categories of meat, fish, eggs, veggies, fruits, nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, healthy fats, even oils, which is interesting because I don't know where they kind of pull some of the restrictions from that age, but then also loop in some things like oils. So those are some of the foods to eat. I'll talk about those specifically in a second. So the foods to avoid, which again, hinging off what you're saying, which is start kind of set the tone for kind of the curiosity about how some of these parameters were set up, is foods to avoid, which are processed foods. Again, hunter-gatherers didn't have access to, the food equipment, the manufacturing, industrial age benefits that we have, if you consider those benefits. Sugar, of course, specifically added sugar, because there's lots of sugar, of course, in fruits, but that's fructose. That's a part of this. But we're really talking about some of those added sugars. So these are foods to avoid: processed foods, sugars, soft drinks, grains, most dairy products, legumes. I know you've got thoughts about that. Artificial sweeteners, right? Vegetable oils, margarine, trans fats, et cetera, et cetera. So very practically, if some of those categories are still kind of vague to you, I did dig into kind of what are some very specific tenets that the modern paleo application looks like, or what are some of the specific foods. So when it comes to meat, they're primarily focused on beef, lamb, chicken, turkey, pork, and some of those others that, again, they would have had access to as hunter-gatherers, okay? When it comes to fish and seafood, we're talking salmon, trout, haddock, shrimp, shellfish. And of course, they Which is something I can appreciate. They are kind of environmentally minded to a certain degree. They do push. They should be, humanely raised. A lot of times grass-fed is a focus. Also wild caught when you're talking about salmon. And so in that respect, I think we have a healthy appreciation for what they're thinking about and approaching some of these meat sources from an environmental standpoint and from a humane standpoint. When it comes to eggs, they may be free range. They might be pasture. They might be omega-3 enriched. Those are all sort of included. Veggies, of course, virtually every vegetable, there's a specific emphasis on things like broccoli and kale and peppers and onions and carrots and tomatoes. Fruits, a lot of focus on apples and bananas, oranges, pears, avocados. Yes, avocados are fruit. Strawberries, blueberries, kind of really any berry, really, which is great. Also tuber crops. And so we're talking potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, turnips. Some of those root foods would be included in paleo. Nuts and seeds. Almonds, macadamia nuts, walnuts, hazelnuts, sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, et cetera, et cetera. And then healthy fats and oils, so some extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil. Again, that's what they classify as some of those healthy fats, which we would as well. And then salt and spices, sea salt, which, by the way, fun fact, is not shown to be healthier than just table salt, but sea salt, garlic, turmeric, rosemary, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all some very specifics. Those are some of the foods of focus, if you will, of this diet. Now let's talk about the foods to avoid. Again, we talk about sugar and high fructose corn syrup or added sugar, soft drinks, fruit juices, table sugar, candy, pastries, ice cream, and many others. So some of you are like, well, then I'm not doing paleo. And I get it, because I love me some ice cream. Okay. Grains, which one, again, we're starting to hint at, we'll talk a little bit more about. So breads and pastas, wheat, spelt, rye, barley, et cetera, et cetera. Most dairy, you heard me mention most dairy. So especially low-fat dairy, right? Because that takes an extra step, at least in the processing. That's more about
what dairy is included.
I think they would have more full-fat dairies, some full-fat, whether it might be milks, might be full-fat cheeses. I don't know, and I think it kind of depends on that. There is some full-fat. Again, a lot of this is gray area because, right?
My source said just no dairy at all. So
yeah, I found a couple where they're talking about they do have some of this. So it's even like when you think about the carnivore diet, which we're not going to explore this month, but they will branch into some of those, but they're always very emphatic. It's got to be full fat. So that might be something that, again, is really kind of regional. It's person to person. I think a lot of that's the case with paleo. I know and have spoke with and worked with people that are like, oh yeah, I do paleo, but yeah, I still eat ice cream. And, it's like a lot of things. They're kind of holding to the tenets, or they're holding to kind of an 80-20 mindset. Like 80% of the time I'm on paleo, but the other 20%, I'm not. And so I think some of these foods have slipped in there, but I did find a couple sources that said most dairy is for the most part excluded, especially the low fat or the non-fat, right? But that there is some room for some full fat dairy at times. Okay. Like butters and cheeses and such. So, which is interesting, right? But I don't know. Maybe they're as the archaeology is uncovering more tools, maybe they're getting more loose with their system. So some vegetable oils to avoid: soybean oil, sunflower, cottonseed, corn, grapeseed, safflower, et cetera, et cetera. Artificial sweeteners: aspartame, sucralose, cyclamates, I think is how you pronounce it, saccharin, a couple others that I can't pronounce, essentially artificial sweeteners, which again would not be included in that Paleolithic age. And so they would say avoid that. And then just highly processed foods. These are foods that are, I think they have a saying in paleo, like if you couldn't grow it, don't eat it, or something like that.
Or you can't pronounce it, don't eat it.
Yeah, which is funny because if you look at the components of a blueberry, I can't pronounce 90% of what a blueberry is made up of because it's all chemicals, right? So some of that falls down really fast. Like, don't eat anything you can't pronounce. I'm like, well, then I can't pronounce what's in a blueberry because those chemicals are crazy, but they're good. They're amazing. Everything's made up of chemicals, by the way, and that's a topic for another day. But really anything labeled diet or low fat or has a bunch of additives, artificial meal replacements, et cetera, they would say to avoid. Okay. So anyways, I know it was kind of a long list, but really wanted to, and you can start to see how you get into that, and there's discussion and different sources and different topics. And so you may experience this. You may talk with someone that does paleo and they're totally fine eating cheese. And then someone's on paleo, like, that's against our tenets. And so there's just a lot of that flex within this. But let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons, because there are some pros. I think we find some overlap with what we teach and with broader research as research has continued to bear out in the terms of both short and long-term health outcomes and what is proper intake of nutrients. And so if you don't mind, I'll kind of go through a couple pros and then feel free to, of course, jump in. I know we went through just kind of a long list of food, but let's get back to kind of assessing this diet, if you will, now that we understand what it looks like. So some of the pros that I found, and you may have some others as well, Danielle, is, there are studies that suggest that paleo can lead to weight loss. Now, if you know me, I love talking about energy balance. Paleo does not cause weight loss. However, only a negative energy balance where you consume fewer calories than you expend on average over time. That's the only mechanism that causes weight loss. So when people say, well, I lost weight on paleo, or paleo causes weight loss, what they mean to say is, when they've heard people go on paleo, what happens is that they end up establishing a negative energy balance. Paleo is not the mechanism by which the body loses weight. A negative energy balance is the mechanism by which the body loses weight. However, for many people, particularly when they first start paleo as an eating system establishes a negative energy balance because they end up consuming fewer calories than they expend over time. And there was a recent study, 2021, I believe, really fascinating study that showed that when they had the same group of people, they put them through two general phases of this study. In the first phase, and I forget the exact Latin term for this, it's like ad libitum or something like that, which is essentially this was a controlled study where they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. Right? They did not control calorie intake. They adjusted for macros. They made sure that they were adjusting for macros. They controlled other variables, but it was a study where they were able to eat as much as they wanted. First half of the phase, they ate almost entirely ultra processed food. That's what they gave them. That's what they fed them and said, you can eat as much as you want. So they just ate, through the first phase of this study. And then what they did is they took the same people, said, okay, in the second phase of this study, you can now eat, you can continue to eat as much as you want, but then they served them mostly whole, natural, unprocessed foods. Magically, guess what happened, right? They consumed on average 500 calories fewer, though no one controlled their calories or said, stop when you get to this number. No one controlled their calories, but when they were consuming whole, natural, unprocessed foods, they consumed 500 fewer calories. And they ended up being in a negative energy balance of about 500 calories. They consumed 500 calories less than their energy expenditure without anyone controlling that or without them tracking their calories, which equated to about a pound of weight loss per week. So again, it can show that.
I know why.
What's that? I know, right?
I said, I know why.
Yeah. Right. So this is what happens when your body is satisfied with nutrient dense foods, right? So all this going back to paleo. So several studies have shown, yes, paleo can lead to weight loss. It doesn't cause it, but it can lead to it. How? Because it focuses primarily on these nutrient dense whole foods. Now we have some cons associated with it, but so when you hear that, you hear friends say, I went on paleo and I lost weight. Make sure you're not getting that false or that misattribution in your mind that paleo equals weight loss. Because if you eat paleo, but you consume more calories than you expend, you will gain weight on paleo. Okay. It is not guaranteed that you will end up in a negative energy balance. However, studies have shown that when basically the higher quality or the more nutrient dense foods we eat, we need less of it because our body is satiated, it's full, it's satisfied. It's fueled up, as opposed to highly processed foods, which are hyper palatable and often do not fill us up because they're low in things like protein, they're low in fiber, so they don't fill us up, so we end up over consuming them. Okay, so
yes. So the reason I wanted to pipe in there is the protein and fiber. Yeah. Protein and fiber, and I think, like you said, the highly satiating. I think some told me marketing technique is the crunchier it is, the more likely we'll keep going. I don't know where I heard that from, but
it's fun.
Yeah,
it's
like
funny
crunchy.
I have a coworker. So and for those of you like, what do you mean a coworker? Danielle's your coworker. So I still have a full-time marketing career, and I have a coworker who has termed it crunch therapy. which is one of the ways that her anxiety or stress level, as it rises, one of the ways that she works on that is through crunch therapy. And we talk about that. She's not a client of mine, so I don't like get all nutrition coach on her. But it's interesting that there's like this term out there among folks that are like, yeah, I use crunch therapy when I'm really stressed. And I think to your point, that's where a lot of that overconsumption can come from, because we're seeking out some of that, that food to reconcile some of our emotions at that time.
Yes, I most certainly, that definitely is mindless eating or emotional eating, using food for comfort. But I think, like when things crumble, it takes up less space in our stomach.
Oh, interesting.
So we're not feeling as satisfied.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's fun to see. I think it's really just when you're switching to paleo, you're probably increasing your fruits and veggies and
Yep.
protein. So. But
100%. And these are some of the things, by the way, that we teach. And so this is really similar, right, to the 4 pillars that we teach, which are not the only foods you can eat. This is not a diet that if you're listening to this, you're like, oh, what are the 4 pillars? Those are the only foods I'm ever going to eat for the rest of my life. We're not instilling a diet here. What we're talking about is pillars. Pillars support other things. So there are other foods that you can eat. But in general, when we talk about preferring more of certain foods in our diet, you can see that paleo is fairly similar to our 4 pillars. Now, they have some also very distinct differences, but we generally teach the 4 pillars of nutrition as this. Number 1, lean meat, seafood, and dairy. Number 2, fruits and veggies, which includes beans, legumes, lentils, whole grains. It's number 3, and number 4, nuts and seeds. So you can see that almost reads like paleo. If you take out dairy, if you take out whole grains, you talk about lean seafood or lean meat and seafood, fruits and veggies, nuts and seeds. You're like, that's paleo basically. But we have reasons why we include dairy, and that's why we include whole grains as well. But again, with the list of pros that we're unveiling here, I would say that, and I think we would agree, Danielle, that one of the things that is a positive about this is that it encourages whole, mostly unprocessed foods, right?
Yes,
that's a good
absolutely.
thing, by the way. That's conventional nutrition wisdom. You don't need to be under the banner of a diet with a name to just prefer more of those, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you can't 90% of the time be focused on these and then feel bad about having a bowl of ice cream at the end of the day, or a fun drink when you're on vacation, or fun food with your kids, or a pizza night, or anything like that. Now, do we want pizza and ice cream all day, every day? Of course not. No one believes that is going to equate to good health outcomes, but this is a style of eating that focuses primarily on whole, unprocessed, what we would call nutrient-dense foods, many of which are the same as the 4 pillars we teach. It does encourage. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep.
I think it has to do kind of like with your mental status with being on a diet. So I feel like there's a lot of guilt, like you just said, when you get off or you have something with added sugar. Then I think that's what, kind of the umbrellas that I think of is a diet that's promoting more balance, which this diet is doing a little bit of, and a diet that is more of an elimination type diet. And this has a little bit of that as well. Yeah. So I feel like when there is any type of elimination part of the diet, 1, it's hard to follow long term. 2, it can increase risk of nutrition deficiencies. And 3, there's that guilt factor. Like, I have to be on this. And if I take one little, treat or one little day or what, and so I always hear treat days or
cheat days.
Yeah.
I always ask them too. I'm like, who are you cheating on, or what are you cheating on? Are you cheating on Monday
yourself,
through Friday?
Health,
Are you cheating on broccoli? Like, what are you cheating on when you have a bowl of ice cream at the end of the day? So, but I also have to admit, early in my fitness and nutrition walk, way back in my, early 20s and such, I remember being like, oh yeah, cheat days. It's the day where I can eat whatever I want. And then I'm really strict and on point the other 6 days. And so I confess to have been a part of that culture at one point, but that never led to more freedom. And it ultimately didn't lead to long-term results, which I enjoy not even at the age of 41 now, because I've broken free a bit of the shackles of that prison, which is that's just Saturday. You eat whatever you want. And by the way, you end up feeling like absolute trash when you do that. I would rather sprinkle my fun foods throughout the week as opposed to load it up into a Saturday, because then it destroys my Sunday. I was mopey by Monday. Anyways, so yeah, I definitely hear you on that. Like, those are definitely some of the big cons, right? So we love that they encourage whole unprocessed foods and lean protein and fruits and veggies and nuts and seeds. Again, very similar to our 4 pillars. They reduce added sugar. They reduce refined carbohydrates. these are things that are consistent with general nutrition wisdom. It doesn't mean you have to adhere to the strictest tenets of paleo to see the benefits of those. But to your point,
one more
there
point
are cons.
before we move on is like, if you do have a mentality really that you don't feel guilt when you have something, you know, like a dessert or something, or pizza or whatever, that's something that's not on the diet. If you don't feel guilt, then you're essentially, you know, doing what we're preaching, right? Like, you're just decreasing your processed foods or your added sugar.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't wait for you to get to the benefits, because the benefits of dairy is what I want to talk about.
Okay. Well, we're there basically. Let's talk about some of the cons, because you're bursting at the seam. And so there is a reason why the first pillar that we teach, again, preferring more of these foods in these categories, is lean meat, seafood. They would stop there. Paleo would stop there. Get your lean meat and your seafood, and then they move on to fruits and veggies. They move on to nuts and seeds. So let's talk about why we include dairy is the first pillar. Let's then talk about, after that, why we include whole grains. And so this is one of the cons. So we talked about some of the pros. Let's talk about the cons of paleo from a nutrition standpoint. The number one, I would say, is exactly where you were going. It teaches you to avoid dairy, despite some people dabbling or full fat or not, what level of process. Okay, whatever. There is a bent against dairy, and we would argue dairy is a nutrient dense component that you should include in a well-rounded nutrition regimen. And I'm going to toss it to Danielle, because you can't wait to tell us why.
Well,
so go ahead.
Okay. So, you know, I really do love dairy. It's not necessarily my favorite food. I just feel like, continuing education after continuing education, I find all these benefits of dairy, like lowering high blood pressure. But let's just talk about like the specifics of dairy. It can be a probiotic source. So that gut microbiome, you really want to support that, because that's connected to your whole body. So it even, you know, affects your mental health. So when you're picking a yogurt, aiming for 5 probiotics or more. This is why I tell almost every client about my favorite superfood is kefir, because it has 12 probiotics. Right.
Kefir, if you're listening to this, if anyone from Kefir is listening to this, send us a note. We'd love to talk about a little. That's right. Little business I would love interaction, because we're big fans over here, Danielle especially. So if anyone from Kefir is listening to this, give us a shout. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's so fun. So some dairy sources are a source of vitamin D. So milk, kefir, and some yogurts have added vitamin D.
And I think we talked about this last week. Vitamin D is hard to come by in food, correct? We talk about how people think of vitamin D in the sun. The sun helps synthesize vitamin D within the body. However, vitamin D is pretty tough to source from foods, right? So the ones that do have it, there has to be a specific emphasis to make sure you're including that, because vitamin D, of course, is very important. So all that's to say, I think we touched on that last week, but that just reemphasizes the point that there are certain foods, right, that have them, and therefore it creates an emphasis as opposed to an aversion.
And you mentioned one, calcium already. That's, you know, vitamin D and calcium supporting bone health. I think that's the only one that you really get advertised about, you know, as far as marketing goes. Milk, you know, strong bones. But it's a low fat protein source. And I would say I'm definitely a advocate for low fat. So for heart health, you know, I understand the less processed things, but there's plenty of other processed foods you can work on with that. With dairy, I think we don't want, I know that heart health wise, we need the plant to be our source of fat, not the animal. So you have saturated fat in our animal-based sources, and that contributes to heart disease. So when we're wanting full fat, I'm definitely not a proponent of low fat diets by any means. By any means. So fat from the plants is best. So I would say a low fat protein source. Here's a little nerd part. 9 essential nutrients in dairy. One is iodine, which is essential for thyroid hormone. So I don't know if you learned this, Mark, a long time ago, the goiter belt. Does that ring a bell?
I've heard of it. I don't remember much details about it, though. I know I've come across it.
So way back in history, like I did this continue to ed a while ago, so I'm not going to give you tons of details because honestly, I'd have to go back. But the goiter belt was a region of the country that had lack of iodine, so they got the goiters, those things on the neck. That's kind of like a enlarged. I don't know how you describe that. Yeah. Do you know what it looks like?
Yeah. I can see. I can see a picture in my head, and I'm sure some people are googling it on their phone right now as they listen.
Yeah. So that was because of iodine deficiency. Now, iodine deficiency is actually now of newest concern, because now our processed foods are not including iodized salt as much as they used to be, and then on top of that, people are buying like sea salt or Himalayan pink salt, these, what do you call them? Boutique kind of salts.
It's funny. I was going to say like craft salt, everything's about craft beer and craft whiskey and craft salt. Apparently, like, look, it's pink. It must be healthier. Right. Yeah. But color. It is disproportionately, it is virtually the same as table salt, but you're talking about that small percentage of change, and some of that's been removed is the iodine content, correct?
So yes, iodized salt versus the sea salt does not have iodine. So iodine, you can actually get thyroid disease if we're not getting enough iodine. Wow. So dairy has a good source of iodine, but there's not a ton of other ones. The other one is seafood. So you would have to really go to the Institute of Medicine to find other sources if you don't like dairy. I know a lot of people don't. And seafood could be a source of iodine for you. Okay, this is kind of fun. So dairy, like I said, has 50%. No, I just told you there's 9 essential nutrients, but one is iodine. Dairy has 50% of nutrients needed for brain development, for pregnancy, in children, pregnancy through children. So, now you're like, well, we're probably talking about not putting paleo kids on diets. Why are you bringing this up? It's because kids are watching parents. So if the parents are not eating dairy, those kids might be thinking dairy is not good for me. So having that negative picture of dairy is more of my concern. I don't think people are putting their kids on paleo. I sure hope not. But so I think that's a powerful point. I mean, in that regard, as parents know, as I've heard it said, more is caught than taught. So you might not be telling them dairy is bad, right? Or these things are bad or carbs are bad, but you may be living in a way, eating in a way that they are catching that as a message from you. And to your point, that's part of the dynamic of having kids and having a family. Like we don't get off like, well, I had kids, but they're not going to pay attention to anything I do. So I can kind of do whatever I want. I can go into this diet and it's not going to affect my kids. It will. I mean, the way that we eat is on display often for our kids a lot. So that's a very, very powerful point. And just so people know, I know you don't self-advertise very well, but Danielle has an amazing a heart for family nutrition. And so if you're listening to this and you do have family nutrition considerations, questions, frustrations, struggles, and you would like to talk about those with Danielle particularly, because she's far better at this than I am. I learned so much from you when we talk about family nutrition. So anyways, all that's to say is a little pause point there. We didn't plan on that, not in our notes, like, hey, have a family nutrition commercial in the middle of this whole thing, right? But I know you won't advertise yourself, but to anyone listening, any parents out there, moms, dads, families, single parents, just if we can help in any way, help you navigate some of these nutritional considerations, as you just heard, they can often be more profound than we think. They can also be underneath the surface a bit of our own dietary patterns. And so, feel free to reach out to us. Just head over to the website, hit the contact form. We'd love to hear from you. So anyway, sorry, I had to pause, do a little marketing thing there. Yeah. But, let's keep going. No, that's good. So that was like the benefits I had for dairy. And so that would be a negative for this diet if you're eliminating dairy and or choosing full fat dairy, increasing risk for heart disease. I think the other thing that I had as a negative was the things that were listed on my end as far as the things that they eliminated. So whole grains, legumes, and dairy, they're really affordable and more widely available for people than like wild game and grass-fed animals. So, and nuts, they're, those are more expensive type foods. And so that's a huge consideration that paleo really just might be more expensive. Now I would never say fruits and vegetables. You just need to buy in season. There's ways to get some fruits and vegetables. So it's not necessarily, a great thing as far as that goes.
Yeah. And talk a little bit just about, I don't know if you had details or whatnot, but just in general, because I did have my second con was that it avoids beans, right?
Yeah.
And these are beans, lentils, legumes. These are something, if you guys dig back through our archive, you'll see an episode. I don't know the exact title. It was something like, it was a unique one because it wasn't a question. It was how a dietitian lowered her high cholesterol. And, come to find out that dietitian is Danielle, right? And it's essentially you utilized beans to lower high cholesterol, which runs in your family, and a host of other things. We know it's a great source of protein. We know it's a great source of fiber. We know it's a great carbohydrate. Beans are amazing. I mean, there's beautiful little foods and legumes and lentils, And again, that's one of the things that even though they say fruits and veggies, when they say veggies, for our pillars, veggies has a parentheses, which says, oh yeah, beans, legumes, and lentils. For them, when they say, fruits and vegetables, they exclude the beans. And so all that's to say, that's another point of distinction that we would guide people toward, is not avoiding beans, legumes, lentils for many reasons, not the least of which is, their impact on things like, again, via the fiber, things like cholesterol, things like colorectal cancer, things like heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. So any thoughts on that? I just wanted to also hit that because avoiding beans to me is one of the big deficiencies of this diet.
Yeah, another one that I talk about a lot. It's economical. They're very versatile. So, yeah.
Very cool. And they also avoid whole grains. So let's talk about that real quick. So that's one of our pillars is whole grains. There is a host of research and consensus continues to grow. And you work with a lot of folks that have diabetes, and even in the diabetes space, maybe I'm wrong, but I think there might be some built-in aversion to whole grains, but part of the work that you do is unwork some of that aversion. But in general, whole grains, your 100% whole grains are incredibly important for heart health, incredibly important. They bring fiber, they bring other nutrients, lots of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's another one. Dairy, beans specifically, whole grains, we would say that's an entire category that paleo removes, that we would be hesitant to ever guide someone toward, apart from a very specific medical consideration. And so, like you said, right, all the way back to the archaeological findings, we're starting to find some of the tools that were used to harvest these things, to grind these things, to consume these things, correct?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just say two quick things on the grains. One is I did a continuing ed on really the benefits of whole grains versus other carbohydrates for people with diabetes. So that was really fascinating. And I think the other reason is basically variety. Like if fruits and veggies are your only source of fiber, that's a little scary because one, I think a lot of people don't necessarily like a lot of vegetables. You really need to work on cooking as far as bringing out the flavor, spices and herbs, cooking it different ways, combining it with different veggies. So I feel like I hear a lot burnout on veggies. And I think some people are avoiding fruits because of the sugar. And once again, that fructose is different. It's not added sugar. So the American Heart Association doesn't want us to decrease that sugar. So I think that's one of my biggest scares practically is that we're just going to burn out really. Can we clarify that when you say, just in case someone took it wrong, I think you articulated it well, just in case someone heard, if fruits and veggies are your only source of fiber, that's scary. Like, oh no, those aren't necessarily good sources. Those are amazing sources. What we're saying and what Danielle was saying was what happens is that if we were to tell you only fruits and veggies, right? Chances are you may have a depreciating appreciation for those veggies, or you may only have a few that you like and you don't eat them every day. And so it starts to kind of wane off in terms of total intake, right? So all that's to say that's a variety of which you can dabble in fruits, dabble in veggies, dabble in whole grains. There's lots of research that shows arguably one of the best things you can do for your health is have a wide array of these nutrient dense foods. And so that's the point. The point is not that fruits and veggies are it's scary that someone would only consume those. What we're saying is that a lot of times, if those are the only things you can choose from, you consume fewer of them over time, if that makes sense. So, yeah, gotcha. Yep.
So, and anything else on that? I'd say this has a large reliance on meat. Now, look, we lean meat, seafood, and dairy. That's the first pillar that we have. Meat, incredibly nutrient dense. We do want to look at leaner cuts of specifically red meat, so your tip-top loin round of your cuts of beef, pork, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we're also aware that the more someone generally consumes meat, there is a trajectory that we see bear out in the research in terms of long-term negative health outcomes. And so it's not that meat is bad. It's very nutrient dense. We're actually a big proponent of meat to a certain extent. However, to my last point, we're a larger proponent of a wide array of sources. So don't just think meat's the only place I can get protein. Therefore, if I'm trying to hit optimal protein, I need to triple down on my meat intake, right? You've got things like lean meat. Yes. You've got your seafoods. Yes. You've got your dairies. Yes. You've got protein found in other foods and plant sources of protein, right? And so all that's to say, this does place, I think, an exorbitant emphasis on meat for that protein because, again, they remove dairy. And so it's really about meat and seafood. Right, which we agree with, but we wouldn't agree with, with the restriction beyond that. So that's all to say that diversifying your protein sources is absolutely a best practice in terms of nutritional strategy. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, just having plant-based protein is really going to help with heart health. They kind of basically are taking out 2 of your protein sources with paleo, dairy and legumes.
Yep. Good point. And then my last con is kind of something we already touched on. So maybe if you want to either reiterate that or kind of give a summary, it's highly restrictive. It really is. If you go back to the tenets of it and you take a look at, you can't have a handful of Skittles that in theory, you can't have a handful of Skittles when you go to the movies because you bought your kid a bag. You can't have ice cream at night. You can't have your favorite, you can't have a glass of wine necessarily, though some, again, they kind of loosen up on some of these things. And I'm not trying to frame them as hyper, dogmatic in that regard. But if you stick to the true tenets of paleo, there's no room for these fun foods. And what we see bear out is that long-term health outcomes are attributed to long-term health patterns, right? So let me say that again. Long-term health outcomes are attributed to long-term health habits, and that includes nutrition. And so what we haven't seen is that, man, if I just do paleo in January at the top of the year every year, I'm going to be good, and I just kind of eat however I want the rest of the year. What we're looking for is long-term sustainable nutrition patterns. Again, that's why we teach the 4 pillars: lean meat, seafood, and dairy, fruits and veggies, include beans, legumes, and lentils, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, with your fun foods and other foods in moderation, right? Like we say, like you taught me at one point, like if you want an A on this test that we call nutrition or intake or health outcomes, you should be eating those 4 pillars essentially 90+% of the time. Okay. Not all the time. There's not foods outside of that you can't consume. If you want to be in your health, right? A B plus, you should be consuming this 85% plus of your nutrition. But again, what we will never say is here are the exact foods you need to eat 100% of the time and nothing else, because that's a diet and we don't do diets. So highly restrictive. Any thoughts on that? I know we already touched on that a bit, but when we talked about some of your umbrella themes, but any other thoughts on kind of the restrictive nature as a con?
I mean, I just think it may be beneficial short term just to get people in the habit of getting rid of those processed foods, added sugar and salt, and finding other foods that they can start to enjoy. If it really does increase your fruits and veggies, awesome, but what are we going to do long term? So I think we already kind of touched on everything. Very cool. So yeah, I mean, in short, at the end, do we recommend it? No, for some of the reasons we've discussed. One, we think it removes a couple important pieces from which the body can source some very important nutrients. So we'll kind of leave it there. It is highly restrictive. It's hard to adhere to long term. And so even if you do try it in the short term, make sure that you have an exit plan. Make sure that you understand what you're going to do after paleo. Okay, is to have that exit plan. I'm having a lot of great conversations with folks. Again, it's January. A lot of folks are reaching out to us. We've had a busy month, and it's only, we're only a week or so in, right, of helping folks through some of these nutritional considerations at the top of the year, which we love this time of year. We love channeling that energy. We love channeling that. But what we're channeling it toward is not a 30-day challenge. It's not I'm going to work out 7 days a week for 30 days, or I'm going
I'm going to go strict on my diet and cut out all sugar and all fat and all carbs and all this and all that. And I'm going to just try to, do that as long as I can and white knuckle it. What we want to channel that New Year's energy toward is long-term sustainable habits. So
SMART goals, right?
SMART goals, SMART, right?
Specific,
go through that acronym again. Yeah. Could I even do it off the top of my head? Yeah.
Specific, measurable, attainable. What's the
realistic?
R? Realistic.
Realistic.
And time control. There you go.
Time control, time bound. Yeah. Okay. All right. We should do a thing on that. We should. Clearly, I need to get better at that because, we talk about SMART and our family, like Carissa and I go through like 7 areas of life and we do SMART goals. But for some reason, I can never remember the acronym. Like we have a whole grid that lays it out, we do like finances
awesome.
And faith and social and family and health, all that sort of stuff. We do 7 dimensions of life. We do SMART goals. But for the life of me, I can never remember what SMART means. So I remember specific and time bound. And then in the middle, I'm like, oh. So, anyways, yeah, have SMART goals with the long term in mind, right? And so, one of the things that I might have mentioned it on a podcast or in a conversation with a client recently, but one of the things I like to say is that if your nutrition or fitness plan for January can't last through December, you need a new plan. And the point is, don't look at January as this obsolete island where you're just going to go absolutely crazy and bonkers. And then come February, be like, wow, I got through that. I'm done. The question is then, now what? Right? So I would rather channel that New Year energy into establishing long-term benefits over time. And so with that said, that's really kind of the end of Paleo. And so again, if we can be of help at this time as you're kind of navigating some of these considerations, would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. You can get a hold of us on our website, Imago Nutrition, IMAGO nutrition.com. We have a contact form. You can punch through some questions. We'd love to hear from you and see how we can help. And so if this episode has been helpful, please subscribe. That way you get notified of upcoming episodes. We've got a lot of great episodes coming in 2023. If you could leave us a review, let us know how we're doing. That's always super helpful and encouraging for us. And if you've got a friend who's thought about or heard about or asked questions about paleo, send them this episode. Maybe that we can help some folks sort through these considerations and thoughts. That's why we do the podcast, is to just give as much free value as possible. And so, and on social media, you can find us at Imago Nutrition. So at IMAGO Nutrition across your favorite social media platforms. As always, we'd like to thank Happy Pill for our theme song, Thinkin Bout Food.